Alright guys, we're back in my garage for another video. If you're new to the channel, I use these videos to help keep you updated on the latest developments related to our cars, as well as discuss technical topics so that we have a better understanding of how our engines work. So if you're interested in more videos like that, be sure to subscribe because there will be a lot more coming out in the future. So today we're going to be talking about the next generation of the B58, and I already talked about this previously and I got a couple questions, so just to make sure everybody's on the same level, we have three different versions of the B58 currently. The Gen 1 is the B58 in my car and pretty much all other F-Series BMWs. Then after 2020, the B58TU came out. TU stands for Technical Update, so it's basically just the second generation of the B58. And now the third generation of the B58 is starting to show up at dealerships. So this is currently only offered in the BMW 740i as well as the X740i. These are BMW's flagship vehicles, so they tend to introduce new technology, features, and of course engines in these vehicles, but eventually they always cascade to the other models. So I would expect in the next 1 to 2 years, we'll start seeing this in pretty much all the other BMW models that end in 40i. I do expect this to hit the Supra, but it kind of depends on what the life cycle looks like. If the Supra is only going to last another 1 or 2 years, then it might not make the cut. But definitely if it'll be around for 3 to 5 more years or more, we should see this cascade into the Supra as well. So what I want to do in this video is give you guys the first look at what the B58TU2 looks like. This is not going to be a super detailed video just because I don't have a lot of technical information about the inner workings and tuning in the new B58TU engine. But I do feel like this video is just something a lot of people would be interested in because we want to see what the engine looks like, if there are any obvious differences, and there are definitely things to note just by looking at the engine bay itself. So let's go ahead and jump forward to a clip so that you guys can see what the engine looks like, and then we'll talk about it. So the first thing that you should notice is that the construction is largely the same. So the big change from N-Series to B-Series engines is pretty much going to be the same moving forward for all the future generations. And what we see is basically an intake in the front left side. It goes down to the turbo, then it comes out of the turbo into a plastic charge pipe that routes up to the throttle body and the intake manifold. That routes back to the engine, and then coming out of the engine, it goes into the turbo and out the exhaust. So again, something that we're really familiar with, but obviously looking at it, there are some pretty notable changes. This was not a video that I had a lot of time to make, so that's why I just kind of panned over and did a quick overview. We'll use a couple stills from this video to talk about more details on there. And also I got some other details from Antoine over at Facebook. So thanks again to him for letting me know that this was starting to hit dealerships and giving me a couple pictures of what he was able to see in a car at his dealer. The first thing that jumps out at most people is the intake manifold. So it looks more like the S55 or S58 intake manifold. On the Gen 1 and Gen 2 B58, the core is basically inside of a plastic housing, so you can't really see it. But now in the new TU2, the core is completely exposed and basically just attached to the plastic inlet and outlet on each side. So I think this is going to be a pretty welcome change. It seems like the S55 and S58 intercoolers work a lot better because they're able to evacuate heat through the exposed metal compared to it being completely encased in plastic. So I think it should at least do a better job of cooling off the intake temps. But of course, time will tell once that actually gets into the field and people start testing it out. I don't expect it to be much stronger, and if anything, there might be additional joints where the plastic can be damaged from running higher boost levels, but it all depends on the quality of the plastic welds or how they're actually fixturing it to the actual intercooler core. Again, we'll have to see once we get a closer look at it and people really push the limits how strong that is. But at least from a cooling perspective, I would expect this to perform better. The other thing to note that we mentioned in our original video about the TU2 is that this also includes port injection. And you can see it underneath all the extra hoses and wiring that are going on top of the intake manifold. There is a fuel rail, and that fuel rail is going to have 6 injectors, 1 for each cylinder. I don't know what size the injectors are, and I'm assuming most people are more worried about fitment for aftermarket injectors, so we'll see once the time comes. But that is really good news because all of this can be controlled by the DME, and it seems like the fuel limits will be much, much higher with the port injection included. Now, as far as the engine itself, just looking from the top, it does also look very different. The valve cover looks completely redesigned, even though it still seems to have largely the same function and features. You can see like some of the PCV connections, even though they're relocated a little bit. They're pretty familiar locations and they route pretty similarly, so we can more or less figure out where the high side and low side PCV features are. Also, the ignition system is revamped, so you can see the new coil packs on top of the engine. Honestly, coil packs were never really an issue on the B58, so this might add additional efficiency, but I don't think this is something that you might necessarily want to upgrade or change on a Gen 1 or Gen 2 B58 to retrofit these coil packs. I also don't know about the spark plugs, but again, I expect that not to be a weak point for it. The high pressure fuel pump looks very much the same. I was able to get my camera down behind the engine and get a snap at the Bosch part number. Just because of how the wiring and everything was located, I couldn't see the BMW part number. When I did cross-reference it, just did like a Google search, it showed that it was the equivalent of the existing TU pump part number. So again, I don't expect this to be that much of an upgrade for people with a Gen 1 or even a Gen 2. And again, with the TU2 having port injection, I don't think they're going to be concerned about upgrading it anyway. Now on this one, you can see it has a 2-port turbo. A lot of people were wondering about this because they want to know if it's going to come with a 2-port or 6-port turbo. Keep in mind, both were offered from BMW for a pretty long time. A lot of the bigger vehicles like the 7 Series and X7 always came with 2-port engines. So I know the Supra changed over after one model year, but most cars either came with the 2-port or the 6-port, and I'm expecting it to be the same in this case. The 7 Series and X7 will probably always come with the 2-port turbo, and other vehicles will come with a 6-port version. Now, outside of that, just overall, the engine looks a lot more messy. I think the big thing that BMW is doing, which is on the right track, is they're trying to make it more serviceable. So more of the components that tend to be buried down inside of the engine bay are coming up towards the top. Of course, they have the water pump on top of the charge pipe. This is the same location that they moved it to on the TU, so they kept it there on the TU2. But it also looks like at the back of the intercooler, you can also see the electronic water pump for the entire intercooler circuit. So again, moving that from underneath the headlight and somewhere that's harder to reach just makes it easier to service if it ever does become a failure point. So that should be good for long-term owners. You can also see a lot of additional evap lines and things where, again, on this vehicle, one of the big highlights they mentioned was for emissions and efficiency. So I'm sure all of this plays into effect to make sure that you're minimizing how much toxic gases are coming out of the car and recirculating as much as you can back into the engine. I think eventually people will learn how to delete a lot of these hoses and components that we don't really need, especially for a bigger power build. But probably, at least initially, it'll require a little bit extra work to replace some of the more simple engine components and hardware with all the extra wiring and hoses attached. So yeah, I think that pretty much sums it up. Again, this is kind of like a high level overview, but hopefully it still gives you a little more insight than what you've received elsewhere. So if you guys like this video, definitely share it around, show people that a new B58 is coming out, and hopefully we can actually see it in some higher performing models, smaller vehicles that don't weigh as much as the 7 Series and X7. And then once we get these DMEs unlocked, cross your fingers, we can really see how this car will perform. So yeah, that's it for this video. Thank you guys for watching, and I hope this helps. And if you have any other questions or comments, leave them down below.